Well, welcome back to another episode of the Primary Care Podcast. It is your boy, Dr. Mark List, coming at you with an episode today. But before we get into the actual content of the episode, we're going to hit up the primarycarepod@gmail.com inbox. That's where you send me jokes, feedback, questions, concerns, things that you want me to talk about on the podcast. Today's topic is something that I looked up recently or read recently. But before we do that, we have actually a viewer email that I wanted to listen to, or a listener email that I wanted to read. Dr. List, I have a joke for you today. Did you know that t-shirt is actually an abbreviated version of the longer version of the word Tyrannosaurus shirt because of the short arms? Love it. All right, let's start the podcast.
The Primary Care Podcast is written and edited by a family physician for an audience of other physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, residents, and medical students interested in primary care topics. This is not a podcast for patients and should not be used as medical advice. This is also a personal podcast produced on my own time and solely reflecting my personal opinions. Statements of this podcast do not reflect the views or policies of my employer, past or present, or any other organization with which I may be affiliated.
Thank you for listening to the Primary Care Podcast. I'm Dr. Mark List, here to bring you the latest news, guidelines, and updates from primary care sources around the globe. Keeping it under 15 minutes long because you're in a hurry and I'm not that smart. Well, welcome back to the podcast, pod girls, pod boys, pod people. It is your boy, Dr. Mark List, coming at you with another episode today of the Primary Care Podcast. I found the introduction disclaimer. I am so happy. Anyways, thanks for tuning in today. Today, we're going to go back to bread and butter, primary care stuff, no practice management stuff, although the feedback to that was really good. We'll have more in the future. I've already got some ideas. But the article today is from the Journal of Hypertension, okay? Just recently here in July in 2021. And one of September 2021. The title is Comparative First-Line Effectiveness and Safety of ACE Inhibitors and Angiotensin Receptor Blockers, a Multinational Cohort Study. So obviously ACEs and ARBs are the first-line treatment, right? The 2017 AHA-ACC guidelines and the 2018 European Cardiology and Hypertension guidelines all say that ACE inhibitors and ARBs are the best, the gold standard, the ultimate treatment of high blood pressure. Okay, so this is not, right, I'm not teaching you guys anything new, right? This is basic bread and butter. But here is why this article got my attention, okay? Number one, Hypertension is a big magazine. Number two, this is one of the few times, and this is not a randomized control trial, this is a cohort study, okay? So looking in real life data, but not in a trial, which we'll talk about. But if you look at all the data, ACEs and ARBs are pretty much equal. If you look at head-to-head, when they do go head-to-head, basically the data has always been, ACEs and ARBs are about equal. And that's what I was always taught, and that's always been true. But this study is really, really interesting because of what it shows when we compare kind of the head-to-head variety of ACEs versus ARBs, because there are very few studies out there. So when we look at these multinational cohort, this multinational cohort study, right? They looked at open observational data through this GitHub network, whatever. And so basically, there was multiple countries that were involved in this. So there's South Korea is involved, Colombia is involved in it. There's a bunch of data sources. IBM market stand commercial claims encounters. Basically, they data mined all these different multinational databases, okay, including Medicaid, including Germans. There's a South Korean data in here. There's University of Irving Medical Center that's in Dallas. Columbia University. It wasn't the country of Columbia. It was actually Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Interesting. Okay, I was completely wrong on that. Optum, which is insurer or a pharmacy group. Optum, a de-identified electronic health record data set. So basically, they took a bunch of kind of big data sets, okay? And what they did was they looked at all new users on an ACE or an ARB, okay? So they had to be in the data set and then had to have a new onset of an ACE or an ARB in this. And then they basically followed them from July 1996 to March 2018. Okay, so a long time that they followed them, and they looked for all the kind of like what happened down the line, right? So if they started an ACE or if they started an ARB, what happened? And they looked at a wide variety of things. So the primary outcomes were basically the big stuff we always talk about when we talk about these studies, right? Acute MI, heart failure hospitalizations, strokes, and composite major cardiac events, basically, MACEs, as we've talked about in this podcast a trillion times, okay? And then there's a bunch of minor secondary outcomes type stuff, okay? And not to bore you with the entire analysis, because obviously you're looking at a cohort study, it's not a randomized control trial, but the main outcomes basically said everything pretty much performed identical, right? So the calibrated p-value on acute MIs in ACEs and ARBs totally about equal, right? The hazard ratio of 1.11, but crossed the confidence interval crossed 1, so completely non-statistically significant. Major cardiac events similar, almost no statistical significance. Heart failure, stroke, again, exactly equal between the two, which is what we've seen in a lot of other head-to-head trials, right? But, and here is the big practice changer for me, right? ARBs had significantly fewer side effects in a couple of key, really important factors, right? The two that we would expect to see, coughs and angioedema, right? And angioedema by a hazard ratio of 3.5 increase. The cough was only 1.3, so I was actually surprised that there wasn't as much cough as there was angioedema with the ACE inhibitors that were reported in these data sets. Significantly higher with ACE inhibitors and ARBs. So ARBs significantly more well tolerated in those two side effects. The other p-values that were all interestingly affected, right? Abnormal weight gain and weight loss. So the extremes with ACE inhibitors, both statistically significant. Acute pancreatitis, significantly worse with ACE inhibitors, which is not a commonly reported side effect of ACE inhibitors. And then the other thing was acute GI bleeds were far more likely in ACE inhibitors than in ARBs. There were a bunch of other ones that the p-values were really significantly worse with ACE inhibitors. But when they actually did the comparison trials and they kind of calibrated for all the other factors, they lost their statistical significance, right? Because again, this is not a head-to-head. They don't randomize. They basically just have these two data sets and then they just show the outcomes. And so after they calibrate and then they kind of randomize basically on the back end, right? They calibrate the hazard ratio. A lot of these statistical significance for all the other side effects. But what were the other side effects? Worsening diarrhea, worsening dementia, worsening episodes of acute renal failure, worsening hyponatremia, worsening hypotension, worsening nausea, worsening more likely to have rash, more likely to have vertigo, more likely to have vomiting. Almost every single risk was worse when it came to ACEs compared to ARBs. Vomiting was worse with ARBs. I take that back, but not statistically significant. And so you have all of these symptoms. You have all of these things that are worse with ARBs or worse with ACE inhibitors, but are better with ARBs. And so again, the main four were angioedema and cough, not surprising, but acute pancreatitis and GI bleed, even after they did randomize, even after they kind of pseudo-randomized them and compared all the baseline and comorbid conditions, those four still persisted. So what's the take home here? I have historically always used lisinopril as my starting blood pressure agent, right? ACE inhibitors have always been well tolerated. They're always first line, as we said with all the guidelines. But I've always started lisinopril, and then I've always said, well, if you have issues with lisinopril, then we'll switch over to an ARB. But this study adds to the list of ongoing support for why are we even starting with ACE inhibitors? Why don't we start with ARBs, since patients are far less likely to get any side effect from an ARB that they wouldn't get with an ACE inhibitor? Why don't we start with ARBs? So I'm not sure if you're just smarter than me out there and maybe you've been starting ARBs and not ACE inhibitors for a long time, but this is actually a practice-changing study for me. Based on this and other data, the evidence is mounting that says don't bother with lisinopril, just start losartan, right? Just start one of your ARBs instead, assuming that you've got good availability, you've got good coverage for these, that you're able to find cheap generics, and internationally that should not be a concern. But I think that this is going to be practice changing for me, where I think that this has finally been the final nail in the coffin, that I've been thinking this for a while. Well, yeah, well, I'm starting lisinopril, and then I'll switch to I'll switch to losartan if they have a cough or angioedema. I think this is going to be the final proof that just says, like, hey, don't be an idiot. Just start with losartan. And if you are starting with an ARB instead of an ACE inhibitor, great. Pat yourself on the back. You've been probably practicing kind of the optimized medicine. Just to avoid even talking about the cough, even talking about the angioedema risk, because they are so significantly less. Not zero, but a whole lot less with these ARBs. So that's the big take home today. There's another study that came out recently that I just wanted to touch on very, very, very briefly. Let me pull that up here real quick. And this article is actually in the American Journal of Medicine here in September 2021. And it is the risk of electrolyte disorders, syncope, and falls in patients taking thiazide diuretics, a cross-sectional study. And so they looked at basically 65,000 patients that went to the ER, emergency department visits, 65,000 patients. And then they looked at, let's see people taking thiazides, including hydrochlorothiazide and chlorthalidone, And most of them were hydrochlorothiazide, but we know that chlorthalidone has slightly better blood pressure control based on this data, that it actually controls hypertension better, but has significantly higher rates of side effects such as hyponatremia and falls and lightheadedness, etc. And so of these 65,000 patients that they looked at, 8% were thiazide users. So they took 8% of these thiazide users, and then they kind of controlled them by adjusting the outcomes, matching them to patients that were on similar loop diuretics, similar use of loops, similar use of ACE inhibitors or ARBs, similar ages, and kind of to prevent any confounding variables, And patients on thiazide diuretics, HCTZ and chlorthalidone in ER visits, were 3 times more likely to have acute kidney injury, twice as likely, double as likely to have hyponatremia, twice as likely to have hypokalemia, which we don't always talk about a lot with diuretics, with hydrochlorothiazide in particular, 3 times more likely to have a recent fall, and twice as likely to have a syncopal episode. So in this podcast, we just talked about how ACEs and ARBs, let's start with ARBs because they have less side effects. Both are really good at preventing major adverse cardiac events, MIs, strokes, etc. This is a study that says, second line still remains basically thiazides, calcium channel blockers right there with you. But with your thiazides, you really have to be careful about hyponatremia, hypokalemia, falls, syncope, and acute kidney injury, right? Significantly higher rates, even when you compare them to thiazide users to non-users, even when you compare them for the other adjustments, So very important that, yes, those are good management, those are good drugs for the management of blood pressure, but you really just have to be careful. Again, chlorthalidone I love. It really works well for hypertension, but you really have to talk about the risks of hypokalemia and hyponatremia, specifically hyponatremia, syncope and falls, because they do happen quite significantly more with chlorthalidone than hydrochlorothiazide, and with diuretics, specifically thiazides, even more so than anything else. So hopefully today's re-talk, kind of a review of hypertension management was helpful today. Again, having those conversations with patients, being smart about watching for side effects, maybe being smart and just starting ARBs instead of ACEs in the first place, watching diuretics as a second line, specifically thiazides, but then making sure that you're following up on BNPs, basic metabolic panels, and that you're having really good talks with your patients about potential side effects and what to look out for and what to call you back on. And if they are having those issues, maybe switch calcium channel blockers, etc. So hopefully this was a helpful podcast episode today. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week or whenever I get into another one. Reminding you, you don't need to stay up all night, stay up to date. This has been Dr. Mark List with the Primary Care Podcast. Thanks and have a great week.